Hello again. Welcome to this Lunchbox talk at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. We're really grateful to have all the folks here in the room as well as our friends on Zoom with us today. I am Joanna Massey-Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement here at the Garden. And in the back of the room, we have David Michaud, who's supporting us with our Zoom audience today. And I'm really excited about another opportunity here in partnership with the New Hope Bird Alliance for our Bird Friendly Landscapes program series. Now to introduce our speaker today. Hannah Pursley grew up in a small town south of Charlotte and attended the University of North Carolina of Wilmington, where she received a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science. And after graduation, she worked as a certified arborist in Wilmington for a number of years before joining Audubon, North Carolina, as their urban forestry program manager. She just shared she knew the trees before the birds, and so I love that. That's beautiful. And knowing both of them and their relationships is so important. Conserving birds in the places they need through community engagement, local advocacy, and on-the-ground management is central to Hannah's urban forestry work in North Carolina. With her lifelong passion for environmental conservation, Hannah hopes to create an environment where both people and birds can thrive in our state. So Hannah, thank you for all your work and thank you for being here today. Please join me in welcoming Hannah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is really exciting. So I am here today to talk to y'all a little bit and give a pretty broad overview on urban forestry and birds and why we should care. As I said, I'm with Audubon, North Carolina. I'm their forest program manager, and I do lead up their urban forestry program. It's still pretty new to the space. Audubon has done a lot of really traditional land management assistance in the past, all over the nation, helping people come up with prescribed management plans for their property and things like that. But we really at Audubon, North Carolina, would like to focus on urban forestry, especially here in North Carolina, because North Carolina is growing. And urban forests are the type of forests that we are losing the fastest due to urban sprawl, development, you name it, infrastructure, things like that. And while it's not the beautiful preserved, national forest or, the game lands that are managed, they're still just as important to birds. And so a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today is generally go over what is urban forestry, why is it important for birds, and I'm wondering, I have to be aware of the camera, and what can we do to help our urban forest for birds? And so what exactly is urban forestry? While my definition isn't going to be the very technical spec you might find in the dictionary. Also, this is a really lovely picture from the Hemlock Bluffs Nature Preserve. If you've never been there, I definitely recommend it. And so the way that I define an urban forest is mostly how the forest and the trees relate to people. And so there's that connection and that interaction between trees and people in an urban environment. So that could be street trees, it could be your local park, it could be, your backyard, the trees there, it could be any sort of undeveloped, hopefully will remain undeveloped forest within your community's jurisdiction. And while some trees are maintained by private property owners, some are maintained by the city or the community, but there's also trees that are maintained by utilities. So that could be Norfolk Southern, the trains. It could be Duke Energy, which there's a lot of opinions about Duke Energy, but I'm not going to get into that. And so, like I said, street trees, these are some of the most visible aspects of our urban forest. We see them die all the time and then not get replaced. We see them not maintained, trimmed, pruned, cared for. Really, a lot of communities seem to just stick it in the ground and that's it. No real plan to make sure that the tree survives, but they're often planted in a strip between the street and the sidewalk. And typically, any trees that are planted in that are the responsibility of your municipality. And so you typically need a permit from the city to remove them if it is diseased or dying, or if, you know, it has a broken branch that needs to be trimmed out. That's something you would contact your community about. So my favorite aspect of urban forestry is that actually also to me includes your green spaces within your urban community. So that could be your local park. It could be, you know, recreational areas. It's urban forests that are available for recreational use by the public. And so some good examples of this would be Umstead. It's actually this botanical garden has a little bit of urban forest on it. The greenway system, Fort Frostier recreational area, basically the green spaces in your communities that have trees and are interacted with by the public. And so besides the street trees and your local parks, that kind of really leaves undeveloped land. And I typically don't really like to use the term undeveloped because that means it's gonna be developed at some point. And like, obviously we can't stop every development or every development is bad, but it kind of implies this land is going to be developed. And hopefully at some point we'll preserve more than we develop. But typically this is land that is under your communities or counties, urban forestry department, or their UDO for the county, and UDO means Unified Development Ordinance. And so that's a set of codes that are enacted by your community to manage and regulate the development of land within city limits and occasionally outside of city limits, but within their extraterritorial jurisdiction. So obviously, untouched land, you get more of it the further out from city center you go, until it eventually turns into rural, which seems to make sense. But it's still, if it's under the regulations and boundaries of your community, I would still consider it an urban forest. And a lovely picture of a barred owl about to feed her babies. Sorry, there's a little bit of dead animal on that slide. Probably should have put a warning up. So why does Audubon, North Carolina care about urban forestry? And why are urban forests important for birds? And this is a lovely picture from the backyard bird count. Lovely pair of eastern bluebirds. Love them. They're great. And so we kind of came up with a couple different, well, I wouldn't say we came up with, but we identified a couple main reasons why urban forests are important for birds. And so these pockets and I guess fragmented aspects of the urban forest, whether it's your backyard or a park in downtown Raleigh, they're quote unquote an oasis in a concrete desert for these animals who traditionally have lived in those spaces and have been losing their habitat to development, to human interaction and occupation for the past however long we have lived there. And so these, I guess, bastions of habitat in our urban communities get more and more important as larger contiguous areas become further fragmented. And so it provides vital shelter, foraging resources, in an otherwise barren landscape. And I know a little controversial, but I am a certified lawn hater. There's just not enough it doesn't support enough biodiversity for our pollinators, for our other small animals, for our birds, because come spring and birds are having babies, there's a lot of birds that feed insects to their babies. And so lawns don't really support that. Oh my, I'm so sorry. I keep breathing really hard into the mic. And while some species have adapted to living in an urban environment and alongside humans, think, northern mockingbirds, house sparrows, house finches, some birds kind of really like what we do to the environment. And actually, there's a little bit of a trend in populations in some of those species, but not what's good for some species, other species aren't able to readily adapt to the changes we make to the environment. And so they still need those spaces. And this is by far the most compelling argument that I have really read about in regards to urban forestry and birds is we attract birds to our cities during migration with our lights. And if we are bringing birds to our cities with our lights, we need to be providing habitat for them. That's really just the way I view it. And if we're attracting birds off of their migration tracks, we're confusing them. They're flying into buildings, building collisions, they get lost, they run out of resources. So it's just really like an unfortunate situation by the sheer fact that we have lights on at night in our cities. We are confusing the birds that are migrating through our area. And so if they're becoming attracted to where we live, we need to make sure that they have the resources that they need to stop, rest, refuel before moving on. And so this reason is also a huge reason why a lot of communities are championing a lights out program like New Hope Bird Alliance and things like that, because it really does help when our cities are darker at night. And so this is also a really lovely picture of chimney swifts. They also have a very soft spot in my heart. There's a really, really cool live tree roost on the UNC campus where the chimney swifts will roost in the tree, and you can see them do their swirling nighttime, evening roost behavior where they all fly together and they swirl into the tree. And that's one of the only live tree roosts recorded in our state. And so that's a really wonderful phenomenon. New Hope Bird Alliance and other organizations will put on like viewings for that and have people come out and come watch the phenomenon because it's truly amazing. But it is an urban tree because it's in a community of people. And so protecting our trees where we live can end up having a really huge impact for such a little bird. And so I have to plug the Audubon, North Carolina priority species. And so these are species that Audubon at the national level has identified as priority species, meaning these are species that are either losing habitat, their population numbers are going down, and may need a little bit of habitat management or help or research done to kind of figure out what's going on and kind of get them back on their feet. So, we've got the wood thrush, the chimney swift that I just mentioned, the black-throated blue warbler, one of my favorite, I keep saying my favorite, I like this bird, I like this bird. Well, I just like a lot of birds. The brown-headed nuthatch, which I like to tell people sounds like a rubber ducky. Always get really excited when I see those. The prothonotary warbler, which I only recently learned how to correctly say the first word. I thought it was prothonotary. The bald eagle, which I do want to include this. It's still a priority species, not only as the symbol of our country, but it's also kind of a success story. They were almost extinct several decades ago because of the impact of DDT had on their shells of their eggs, and the shells would be too fragile and break, and they had a really, really hard time raising chicks to fledglings. And so while they have increased in numbers, we obviously don't want those numbers to go back down. And I also included this in a presentation on urban forestry because I have seen bald eagles on the Cary Park Greenway. So they're where we are, and it's surprising but also kind of amazing that these birds of prey are utilizing a dedicated green space that, while it was primarily for people, the animals are still making use out of it and using it as habitat. And then, of course, our lovely little timberdoodle, the American woodcock. If you have never seen them do their little thing, it's pretty funny. I recommend you look it up or try to see it in person. And while those are the benefits of having an urban forest for birds, there's also a lot of really great compounding benefits for people also. And so having a larger urban forest or planting more trees and otherwise expanding your urban forest or preserving local forest from being developed, it reduces the urban heat island effect. It reduces stormwater runoff and soil erosion. It protects stream banks from being washed away. It can reduce heat-related illness, because if your buildings are more shaded, the ambient temperature of the building is going to be lower and your city's going to be using less energy in AC to cool them off. And then obviously I do like to, mention this is going to become especially important as energy usage and things like AC is going to trend upward over the next several decades as the climate is changing and trending to be warmer. In the summer, like much warmer in the summer. I can barely do it now. When it's 95 and like 90% humidity, I turn red as a tomato. It's not fun for anybody. But it also has holistic benefits. Being out in nature can reduce stress. It can improve your mental well-being, the more access to nature you have. And so a lot of cities are actually championing tree equity programs to help expand the urban forest canopy in otherwise disadvantaged or historically redlined communities that didn't have the resources to build up their canopy and plant trees. And so Charlotte is doing things like that, where they're providing, what is the word I'm looking for? Like free tree trimming and maintenance to people in those communities, because they otherwise would likely not be able to do it, or their community might not have the funds to plant new trees or things like that. So I just want to mention that. And as far as Audubon, North Carolina's goals, and part of National Audubon's goals is pursuing natural climate solutions. And I know most people just trees are good, that's great. But also they do sequester and store carbon dioxide, and it could count towards your community's sustainability goals. And so if your community says, we want to have 45% or more canopy cover by 2035, but then they keep cutting down all the trees, you can be like, I thought you said this was important to our community. So what are we doing? You say you care about climate change, so like, what are we doing here? Trees also pull pollutants out of the air. The pollutants will settle on the leaves and come out of the air. The trees also help filter the soil from other pollutants that get washed off into the road. And so that kind of brings me to, how can we help urban forests in general, but also for birds in North Carolina? And this is a really lovely picture from our chapter advocacy day this past year, in 2024. Basically, it's an opportunity to go meet with our elected representatives here in North Carolina and tell them, we care about this. We really want to see an increase in conservation funding. We want to see an increase in, things like funds for our parks, our national forests, our state forests, things like that. Whether or not that happens is a different story. But it is so important to make sure your voices are heard in the things that you care about in your community. And there's probably some familiar faces up there if you squint. And so that kind of leads me to the last kind of third of our presentation is the avenues of advocacy. And so unfortunately, one of the most common calls or emails that we get is, hey, they just clear cut the forest across the street from my neighborhood. What can I do? I know that there was woodpeckers there, there were owls there. What can I do? And unfortunately, if it's already been clear cut, that's not super feasible on changing what's happening, because at that point the permits have been issued, the zoning's been changed for development and things like that. And so one of the most important things that you can do for your community is to learn what ordinances govern your urban forest. And what is your local government's current stance on retaining urban canopy? Who are your allies? Who are potential opponents? And then being aware of, current petitions, council meetings, UDO amendments, things like that when the community has opportunities to come into their city council or otherwise pre-board or, development board and make their views heard to their representatives of their communities and let them know, like, hey, like, you say Raleigh's the city of oaks, but we're cutting down all the oaks. What's happening? Like, there's a little bit of a disconnect here, and like, we care about this. And then also researching and learning what a better tree ordinance could be, but to have realistic expectations. If your community has only like a 10% canopy retention requirement for a development, a commercial development, going to your city council and being like, we want 30% canopy retention. As lovely as that would be, that's probably going to get a really hard immediate no. And so we need to be realistic about our expectations, but obviously still shoot for the moon. And, they may say no to 30, but maybe we can get them agree to 22%, things like that. And then every subsequent UDO amendment draft change, maybe we push it a little bit more. And so I just want people to be aware, like, it's okay to hope and like fight for the best possible outcome, but just kind of be aware and realistic of what actually can be done. But also be aware of any other local politics or other special interests you encounter. Obviously, like, some communities have relationships with certain development firms or, like a housing development builder, things like that. And just kind of be aware of all that kind of stuff that's going on, to make sure you're well informed on who all the players are in your community when it comes to what happens to your urban forest. So I've talked a lot about an ordinance. Ordinance this, ordinance that. But what exactly is an ordinance? It's essentially a law or a code that is passed in your community that details how the trees in your community are regulated. And they don't make them easy to read or particularly riveting. They're usually very, very lengthy, verbose. They're usually divided into sections and then exhibits and definitions and divisions and appendices and diagrams. And it's like they don't make it easy. But your local ordinances can typically be found online on your community's webpage. They can either be found on American Legal Code Publishing, Quality Code Publishing, Municode, or on their own website. Like I said, they should be available for free for you to access. I do not believe I've encountered any community that has made you pay for it. And if someone is trying to get you to pay for it, it's probably a scam. So please don't do that. But knowing what laws apply in your community is the first step. And so these are some ordinance language terms that you will see commonly in regards to urban forestry. And so unfortunately, there's no minimum standard recommendations or state required minimums for urban forestry as far as like canopy retention, things like that. There's also not really a standardization of language across these. So a historic or a heritage tree in Cary might have a different definition in Wilmington. And so that makes it a little bit hard to translate across ordinances. You know, you might see something like a champion tree, which is typically kind of defined as a very fantastic specimen of a tree, either by height, by trunk width, age, things like that, that the community finds value in preserving. Things like DBH, its diameter at breast height, you might see that in an ordinance. That's, you know, when they measure the tree, the diameter, they usually have like a little stick, or they have like a tape, and they measure it to determine what kind of size class it's in. Right of way, like we talked about earlier, kind of related easement, basically who has the power and the responsibility to maintain the trees in that area. Setbacks and buffers, you'll see this a lot in development ordinances. A setback is how far a building can be from the property line. And typically, we would like a bigger setback because then that leaves an opportunity for more of a tree buffer. And so buffers are typically also along the edge of the property line, and typically, you know, if a development is only requiring a 10% canopy retention, they'll just like kind of shove it all to the edge and just build everywhere else. And so you'll see those as buffers. You might see tree protection zone, which is the very, I would say, I know the purpose is to be seen, but it's kind of gaudy. It's the orange fencing around the trees, and there's a big white sign with red lettering that says tree protection zone, do not enter. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I have personally seen construction workers move the fence to drive the machinery over the roots because it wouldn't fit, and then put it back. And ideally, that's not what we want. And sometimes the tree protection zone doesn't really even encompass the whole root zone of the tree. So damage can still typically be pretty common in that instance. You might also see critical root zone. That's a little bit more niche than tree protection zone. The critical root zone of a tree is basically, they kind of measure it as a circle underneath the drip line of a tree is about how far their roots go out, or at least their primary root system. And you'll also see payment in lieu. I actually personally really don't like that this happens, but I understand that it does happen, and sometimes it's the only thing. So some communities will say in their ordinance, okay, well, you can cut down those trees, but you just have to pay a fine. And so some of these larger firms, they can afford that, and they'll just take the hit and just clear cut because it's cheaper, because, you know, they want to completely grade the whole site to one elevation, things like that. Kind of related, you might also see replantings in lieu. So yes, you can remove these trees, but you have to plant more trees back. That's also pretty common. And so power mapping, who has really heard of that before? If you're associated with Audubon, you've probably heard it from Ben Graham. But who makes the decisions in your community about your tree canopy? It's every city's different. Do you have a tree board? Do you have an urban forestry master plan? Do you have a city council? Do you specifically have an urban forestry department? Do you have representatives? Is it your town manager? Finding out who can make these changes in your community and who you need to get the ear of to let them know that you find urban forestry retention important is vital. If you know someone who's friends with someone, and you can go have coffee and be like, hey, like, thank you for what you're doing, if they're doing good things like that. And this is also another picture from Advocacy Day, and some of you might recognize two of the people in the photo. It's Robbie Fearn and Pamela Fearn. They run our Pine Island Audubon Sanctuary out in Kurla, out in the Outer Banks, and they came all the way to Raleigh last year to help talk to their representatives about why conservation is important and why those funds should be allocated. And so meeting these people face to face and getting to know them and what their motivations are, what their perspectives are really, really important to figuring out, okay, what's our angle? How do we convince them that we need to start increasing our urban canopy? Not just for birds, but for people. And so I've talked a lot about ordinance language, and then these are some links where you can find a basic model UDO, which I can also share those links after the fact. That could be disseminated out to all the attendees who signed up. But if your community is so small that you don't even have any sort of tree protections, these are a really, really great place to start as far as ordinance language. And so we have one from Arbor Day, the North Carolina Forest Service has a really good one, and also the North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Really great. They have a ton of information. I feel like the cooperative extension doesn't get utilized enough by our communities, but they actually do a lot. And so I've talked a lot about ordinances, but what does an ordinance look like? And so I've pulled this directly from the city of Charlotte. And so the city of Charlotte actually has a pretty progressive tree ordinance overall. So before a development, they require a tree survey, meaning a certified person has to go out to the property and survey all the trees on that property. How big are they? Where are they? What species? Things like that. And so that helps them determine before even any sort of development happens, oh, there's a tree on this property that has a 3-foot DBH. It's a white oak. It's huge. It's got to be hundreds of years old. We should prioritize saving it. Things like that. Wonderful. Tree surveys, if we can get them everywhere, I would love that. And so, and some ordinances prevent the clear cutting of trees larger than a certain size, but you know, little spindly things they might be allowed to cut down, but then again, that also comes back to payment in lieu. And so even though some of these trees are protected, if payment in lieu is in the ordinance, they can still be cut down, unfortunately. Oops. I forgot that I must have accidentally hit it twice. And so this is another section from the city of Charlotte's tree ordinance. So they have a specific section on heritage trees and what, you know, they are allowed to do with it. Things like that, or incentives for increasing the area of tree canopy. And so the city of Charlotte, I keep talking about Charlotte because they just have a really robust tree protection plan. They will work with firms, be like, okay, well, if you increase, you know, your canopy retention by 5%, we could consider doing X, like maybe reduce setbacks or, you know, a tax incentive, things like that. So there's definitely a gray area when it comes to ordinances and what cities can and cannot or are willing to do. That's also really hard because you might have a code enforcement employee who did it this way for all these years, and then he retires, new person comes in and wants to do it straight by the book. And so the people that the other person had been working with is suddenly like, what do you mean I have to do this? The other guy, he didn't make me to do this. So this is a pretty recent update from the latter half of 2024. This was a bill in our state legislative thing. I forget the word. Session. That's what the word is. But basically, one of the tools that code enforcement people in our communities would use to enforce firms into making sure that they're doing all the replanting requirements, making sure that they retained the canopy and, you know, the otherwise required landscaping. They would withhold the certificate of occupancy until they did that. And this bill says you can't do that anymore. So if the development or the building is otherwise safe, finished, things like that, and there's no other reasonable reason that the certificate of occupancy is being withheld besides just the landscaping, they can't withhold it anymore. And so our code enforcement employees for all our communities are really going to have to try to come up with a different way to enforce these things. And so I also just wanted to highlight a couple Audubon chapter wins in North Carolina in the past 4 years. So we've got Asheville lights out. We've got Cary native plants. We've got Durham native plants. Greensboro lights out in native plants ordinance. We've got Raleigh lights out in an urban forest master plan. Winston-Salem native plants got Winston-Salem got a native plants ordinance. And then most recently, New Hope Bird Alliance got their comments accepted in the Chatham County Unified Development Ordinance. And so when we talk to them, they will listen if there's enough of us and we're kind and say, hey, like, we really care about this. And so I do want to highlight one of the challenges that I've run into personally for urban forestry is that the number one thing I hear from people who work in urban forestry for a city is we don't have the capacity to make sure that everyone is following the UDO. And so, while yes, systemic change is ideal for getting companies and people to follow a tree protection plan, because unfortunately not everyone is pure of heart like you all sitting here and would do the right thing regardless. That's why we have these regulations, is to make sure that people are doing their due diligence for the trees in their community. But if no one is there after the fact to make sure that these firms are following the code, then what's going on? What is that worth? And so I really think that's an opportunity as well to push for is, you know, hey, like, our community, it's not following our tree protection ordinance. We need to allocate funds to hire another code enforcement person. Because time and time again, I hear we don't have the capacity. So just keep that in mind as well. And got a little bit of time for questions, either via Zoom or in the in-person audience. She's gonna come over with. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. A couple questions are coming in on Zoom. The first one, what are your thoughts on safe harbor agreements, which are those voluntary agreements between non-federal landowners and I guess NOAA and the Fish and Wildlife Services to protect endangered species on their properties? You know, what role do these safe harbor agreements serve in tree and land conservations? And does this have significant impact on canopy restoration?
So I will be honest, I don't know a ton about the safe harbor agreements. I don't work a whole lot with the public lands and know it and things. I would imagine right now it's a little tumultuous with the federal funding being frozen and people getting laid off and things like that. I would say generally voluntary, conservation easement type things are better than nothing. Because I know a lot of, the North Carolina Fish and Wildlife or the Wildlife Resources Commission, they will do habitat management plans specifically for endangered species, and they will help with that. And you can potentially get financial assistance to do those things. And so, again, that also kind of relates back to, is there going to be a Wildlife Resources Commission going forward? Things like that, not to be pessimistic. But I can definitely look that up. And if we take note of who said that, then I can email them directly after I do a little bit of research. I don't know everything. I'm sorry.
Hey there, Daniel and Dave from Trees for the Triangle. I was just wondering if you could tell us maybe the top 5 species that we could be planting to help support birds and wildlife here in the Triangle.
Most of those top 5 would be oaks. Oaks support by far the most number of insect species and the animals that depend on those species. So obviously like birds, squirrels. They're also a mass producing species, meaning they produce a lot of food that wildlife can eat. So think acorns, things like that. But obviously like street trees, acorns could get annoying for some people. But I love a dogwood. I love a sassafras, love an eastern redbud. Things like that, great. But just, make sure native is best when you can do it. But if I would err on the side of not saying if it's not native, don't do it. Because at that point, like, a tree is good. So like obviously crepe myrtles are not native, but maybe instead of actively cutting it down, maybe just when it dies, replace it with something native, things like that. So I would definitely white oaks, red oaks, chinkapin, swamp oak. I love a yellow poplar. I love a shagbark hickory. Obviously, not everyone can plant those in street trees areas. But, the smaller species like dogwoods, redbuds, things like that they don't do quite as bad. Does that help? Okay.
We have a question here.
I have a question in regards to ordinances. We've been encouraging, especially when we looked at the Chatham UDO, to include percentages for biodiversity, not just to plant 100% native trees as far as canopy trees, but also include biodiversity percentages within the plantings. Is set by however many trees are going to be planted or shrubs or whatever is going to be planted. Have you seen some very good examples of that, or have some thoughts on that?
I have not seen examples, but by far that is probably after, native, biodiversity is just as important, not only in our our personal landscape, because, that kind of goes back to me being a certified lawn hater. Monoculture is just not what nature does. It's just not. And our species have not evolved to deal with that. So the more diversity of species that you can have in your community is best. And so like Barbara's saying, maybe not do 85% lace bark elm. That's not great. So I think that's definitely something that is like not only a good idea, but probably should be a priority after native plants. But I can do some research and see if I can find any.
We had an online user chime into the conversation around best trees, commenting that cedars are great for winter food and cover as well.
Mhm.
So add that to
Native,
the list.
native hollies, evergreen trees, things like that.
Yeah. We have another question more around other environmental factors. Can you speak around the importance of trees as noise buffers and how human and industrial noise threatens birds and reduces quality of life?
Can definitely speak to quality of life. It kind of does go back to the holistic benefits. I have seen birds live and thrive in very noisy areas. We actually have a Slack channel for Audubon where people can share pictures of birds. There was a American woodcock just doing its thing in Bryant Park in downtown New York City. So like it can be good, it can be bad. Obviously, it's best to err on the side of having more trees to be that noise buffer, to be more natural. And then also you get the added benefit of peace and quiet and breathing in the fresh air and de-stressing and, you know, connecting back to the nature that so many people kind of view humans as apart from instead of a part of it.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. I'm probably not alone in this room in people of this community who are so distressed and frustrated at the number of developments where they have just clear cut the land, and you did speak to that. And in truth, I have not looked into the ordinances. I don't know what they currently are. It seems like we used to have tree ordinances in Chapel Hill. You used to have to do these surveys, and you had to leave as many trees as possible, which is why we have so many wonderful neighborhoods with huge, big trees, because they didn't cut them all down when they developed the neighborhoods. I don't understand why this is happening now, and didn't these people get the message about tree canopies and you know, global warming and things like that? But also, I don't understand like these big block apartment and condo complexes where they leave these tiny little buffers to the streets.
Yep.
That's bad for everybody. But then they plant oaks or maples or whatever in these tiny little places. Don't they have arborists who advise people, who tell them, no, that's not going to work?
So unfortunately, no, they don't typically. Usually when those plans for like a development are drawn out, they hire a consultant landscape architect and they'll recommend species and things like that, which can sometimes be outdated, but also not that many landscape architects are concerned about its impact on the environment as a whole, more so what looks nice.
But they don't continue to, I mean, they
Yeah.
can't grow. They can't grow.
And so part of that is a lot of the developments don't have any sort of quote unquote in perpetuity in making sure that those trees stay alive. So, you know, they might just kind of view it as, okay, we planted these trees. That's it. And so some communities are pursuing that type of like, hey, you need to submit a maintenance plan for 5 years after they're planted. Things like that to make sure that they survive and thrive. And if they don't, if they die, you need to replace it. But I will say, as far as like it changing in Chapel Hill, money.
I was a long time ago part of the first street tree inventory in the state for the city of Durham, was the assistant for it. And we've had to find every street tree in city right of way for the whole city, which was about half the size of what it is now. And what's striking to me is going back and seeing where we had planned plantings and they weren't happening. There's usually a good reason they weren't, but it's pretty depressing. And I will say the program that the director and I came out of at Duke, Forestry and Environmental Studies, that program has done a lot of studies of trees in Durham recently, which I hope you know about. And there are usually good reasons for trees not being there, but sometimes they're not. Was also a council member in Chapel Hill for 16 years, and which gave me a lot of exposure to why trees and shrubs happen and don't happen. And a whole lot of the large apartment complexes that you see came out of a single ordinance in March 2014 that Jim Ward and I were 2 of the 3 votes against because we couldn't tell what it was going to look like. We didn't think it was going to be good. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing, except for downtown, which is a separate state of mind altogether. But what you're seeing in a lot of Chapel Hill, particularly at Ephesus Road area, is that ordinance building out, and it hasn't finished. That's a single vote 11 years ago.
I do have a follow-up comment is when the city council or whoever's in charge approves or denies a request or a permit for development, one thing that I also see a lot is, hey, like, you know, your community said you needed affordable housing. We're building high-density affordable housing. And so that happens, these high-density housing developments happen, but then urban sprawl is still happening. They still end up building single homes also. And so, like, obviously, it's best to do mixed use high density when possible, but that's if you don't also do the urban sprawl to preserve the land that's already out there. But like both's happening at the same time. And so that's another reason.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been so inspiring and galvanizing. I have a lot of ideas that I'm going to try to boil down into a real question, but I think just sort of zooming out from general to specific, yeah, it's just so frustrating to think, to your point that yeah, this is about making our cities habitable for birds, and like you said, it's also making them habitable for us. You know, it's making our urban environment a pleasant place to be. I think I feel so angry about this new ordinance not giving any leverage to enforce these laws. It really makes me think of the River Keeper movement, actually, where they were really running into the very same thing of just a lack of enforcement leverage. You know, the laws were in place, but there just wasn't any enforcement. There's a great book called The River Keepers. It's a great guide for how that developed. It makes me think of the sheriff of Nottingham Forest. You know, like where is our sheriff of the, or you know, our game warden of the urban forest, you know? And so, yeah, I just feel very inspired. I have had the chance to look at the Chatham County ordinance, and, you know, they say things like, we want you to plant screening trees that will grow to maturity in like 2 years. And it's like, what besides the darn Japanese privet will do that, you know? So it's, I could really see that they need a little bit, they're headed in the right direction, but they could use some updating. And I'm throwing too many different thoughts out at once, but I'll end with this. These ordinances are so unuser friendly. I mean, they need to be, you know, they're clear documents. They're very concise. I almost just wonder, you know, if we lose our enforcement in the angle of things, is an education program of the people that are actually, you know, driving the skid steer and you know, destroying the oak tree's roots. Is that who we need to be targeting with maybe like, I kind of wonder if it just comes down to graphic design, you know, if we need to make like a little Cliff Notes guide to these ordinances that's real easy to comprehend. Thank you. Sorry, that was a lot.
Not so much a question as a comment. If you are concerned about what is happening in your local development, as Hannah noted, the best thing to do is to send in comments on the Unified Development Ordinance. And in Chapel Hill, that's called the LUMO. It's not UDO, it's a LUMO. And it is being revised this year by the town staff. So New Hope Bird Alliance will be looking at it. We will be encouraging people to comment on it, in particular because we want, native canopy trees. We don't want non-natives, and definitely don't want invasive trees planted in our urban areas. So if you're interested, join.
Yep. And to follow up your comments, it does really come back to capacity. And so, yes, systemic change is what's going to force these firms to retain canopy. But if we don't have the people to go after the fact to make sure that they're doing what they're doing, that makes it kind of hard.
Well, thank you. Our time has come to an end. Thank you, Hannah, so much for sharing your knowledge of our urban forestry and birds and your perspectives. We appreciate having you here. And thank you all for being here.